Now, tonight, we are very, very lucky to talk about neurodiversity. Before I introduce our panelists who are with me today, I'd like to talk a little bit about what tonight's panel will be about. Neurodiversity and celebrating excellence. Neurodiversity has traditionally been seen as a taboo subject. Over time, we have been able to understand learning differences much more, and in turn, what adjustments that people need. Through this panel, we'll delve into the lives of neurodiverse individuals who have achieved success across a variety of fields. It will explore how living with neurodiversity in a world designed for neurotypical often brings both gifts, such as unique perspectives, as well as challenges from stigma to discrimination. This panel will share their personal stories, strategies in overcoming detrimental stereotypes and rising to the top of their careers, as well as discuss what the future looks like. Is a world where many kinds of minds are accepted and valued finally here, or is this pace of change still too slow? Thank you so much for joining me, Kate and Pravana. I wonder whether you guys would like to introduce yourself for our audience members very shortly. Is that what you, Kate?
Okay, I am a stand-up poet based in the north of England. I've been on Radio 4 quite a lot since 2007 when I started being a topical poet on Saturday Live. I did a PhD at the University of Leeds that I finished in 2018, and that was about how women from the north of England, it was very specific, can resist stereotypes about northernness and their gender and class and regionality through performance, through stand-up performance. And it was at that point, coming to the end of my PhD, that my suspicion that I was autistic became a sort of vital, compelling label I needed to find out more about, because I felt like I was lying in my PhD. So to cut a long story short, because you did just ask me to introduce myself, not give you my entire life story. At that point, I got diagnosed as autistic as a 42-year-old woman, and since then, as well as kind of speaking up for women marginalised, particularly by their class and gender and regionality, I now talk about neurodiversity a lot, in summary.
Thank you so much. Pravina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, so my name's Pravina. I'm comment editor and a columnist at the New Statesman. I also write for papers like The Times and The Telegraph. And I was probably invited here because I was recently chosen to be one of the top 10 neurodiverse women in the UK. It's really exciting to be here because I was at uni here and I spent most of my days in a sort of ADHD haze. So I never thought that I'd be invited to the Oxford Union one day. And yeah, I mean, we'll go on to this more when we chat, but for me, I spent a lot of my life trying to pretend that I was like everyone else. And once I realised that I never would be, that's when everything changed. So that is why something like neurodiversity is so important to me.
Yeah, you both touched on a central theme about almost fitting in and not being like everyone else. Could you talk to us about perhaps when in your early or career developments did you grow into being yourself and start to accept your sort of like unique way of thinking?
Yeah, so for me it was a bit of a journey because as a lot of people with a neurodiversity will know, it can take a while to even realise that you need to get a diagnosis, and then waiting lists can be super long. So there were a number of years until I got a diagnosis, and then I spent a number of years after that trialling ADHD medications until realising they weren't for me. So I would say that things properly changed once that period was over, and that's when it felt like my life could start in earnest because I knew the person I was going to be and whether I was going to be medicated or unmedicated. But yeah, there were a sort of a number of stages along the way of like fighting myself and then accepting myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I really identify with that idea of fighting yourself and then accepting yourself. After my first degree, which was a Communication and Media Studies BSc that I did at Loughborough, I then did a postgrad diploma, trained as a radio journalist. And I kind of loved reading the news, I loved writing the news, I loved going out and interviewing people with a recorder and kind of collating the news, but I persistently kept losing my voice. And I'd have these awful laryngitises, and I'd be like, and I did think, is this symbolic? And I think it kind of was, because actually what was happening was my voice, the me who had quite a lot to say and quite a lot to express, was trapped in this role, which, as I say, I did enjoy. I liked being a radio journalist, but there was so much of the real me that was not being heard. And I went to some poetry writing workshops and started doing bits of stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy was another path where I was not being me. I was a very masked, trying to say the right things, trying to fit the formula of funny. But it led me eventually to being a stand-up poet. Basically, as soon as I met poets, I'd found my tribe. Poets are not generally neurotypical. I mean, I would say the proportion of... So it's interesting, apparently the proportion of neurodivergent people in the world is 1 in 7, so 15%, according to estimates. I tend to think it's more. With poets, though, it must be 60, 70%, if not more. I mean, what neurotypical thinker is going to be a poet, really? Anyway, so I found my tribe. I was fine. Would not have thought at that point of a diagnosis, but got quite involved in, I did a counselling diploma. And again, I was beginning to get these little messages in my head of, you know how you don't fit in and you're quite different? There might be some labels for that. But I resisted that for a long time until the PhD, as I mentioned, where it felt like I was lying by writing a section of my PhD about me as a performer and not mentioning that I was not neurotypical, basically. And my journey to accepting, really accepting who I am, has taken place over the last 5 years since the diagnosis. Whereas before, I thought, you know, if I went on a train journey and was overwhelmed by the sound and the busyness of it and needed to rest after, but then would be like, well, no one needs to rest after a train journey. Now, I'm like, yes, I do, actually. So I will, I'll have my hour and I'll have a rest and I'll be all the better for it. Those little things of truly accepting what my own needs are have been a long time coming. And we were sort of saying earlier, it's really encouraging that your diagnosis has come much earlier in your life, and I think this makes me feel so positive about where we now are around neurodiversity. If the younger that people get diagnosed, I think the better, because then they can truly understand and accept who they are and not have to fight for as long.
That's a very, very, very true and powerful point there. And one thing that I'm picking up in that a lot of people sort of like struggle with, I myself included, is having to fit in and having to find yourself, having to fight yourself, when in actuality it's almost like the world is built around other people and there aren't sort of these triggers or stimulus or practices and mannerisms or norms that allow you to feel comfortable being yourself, allow you to feel that, you know, you can take a nap. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the view that we don't actually create. It's not the case that people are just, you know, divergent and have some form of disability. It's more the case that the way the world is designed is what creates that.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I identify a lot with that, especially like in my years at university here when I was sort of trying to get a diagnosis. It definitely felt like, I mean, I think independent study is one area that is in no way built for neurodiverse people. But what I would say is that, first of all, like things are changing quite quickly. And I do notice, even over the course of a few years, being in workplaces and being quite open about what I need in order to be the best employee that I can be or whatever. People are a lot, you'd be surprised at how accepting people are, basically. Like almost everyone has either a dyslexic daughter or a niece who everyone suspects has autism, or they saw a TV documentary about Asperger's recently. And while it's true that the world isn't built for us and people aren't opening out their hand and being like, hey, we can provide all these things for you, let us know what you need. If you ask for things, and I'd say frankly, like if you don't even ask the question, if you say that this is what I need to do my job and to be the best that I can be at it, people don't really question it quite often. If you don't pose it as something that, if you don't pose neurodiversity as being this weird thing that everyone else needs to like run around to make changes for you, and you just pose it, if you present it as almost the norm, I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, because it kind of, I'm still a bit surprised that what seems to me this very basic understanding that actually, in terms of humanity, many people think, feel, experience and process the world differently to other people, and that we'll have a much healthier, better running, happier world if we accept the different ways that people think, feel, experience and process the world. And it could so easily be the norm, it feels to me, with just that kind of shift of, oh, we see, of course, so you need a quiet space in order to work, but you need a really noisy, busy space because of how you process. Oh, I totally get that. We'll accommodate it. It feels,
yeah. And
actually, by the sounds of it, if you ask in the way of, I'll need this in order to do my job better, then people employers should get it.
Because they're often not big changes, right? Like what you're saying, like I just need a room at certain times of the day quiet, where it's quiet, or like, I don't know, like I would sometimes say to people when I had more boring admin-y aspects to my job, this is when I put my headphones in, and like it's not disrupting people's way of being in any way.
Absolutely. Although it sometimes is those, so I'm just thinking of an example someone gave the other day, if they were saying that they needed to, or they like to doodle in meetings, and someone had actually said to them, do you mind, could you pay attention? And they'd had to sort of go to the meeting leader after and say, actually, I really was paying attention. It's just my way of paying attention involves kind of looking away rather than at you, and also doodling. And I imagine there are many school children who have kind of fallen foul of that particular misapprehension of there's only, in fact, I know that a lot of, for example, academy schools have it in their code of conduct. You must, your listening skills are that you must look straight ahead and make eye contact, and that is very unfriendly to a lot of autistic people. So these, although these little changes, as you say, they're little, they're easy to provide, it's just that when that mindset isn't there, or maybe the understanding isn't there of...
Yeah, you're right. It's only the sort of perceptions which are being shattered. It doesn't actually concretely affect your ability to lead a meeting if someone's doodling. It's more just how we've come to view the way meetings should be conducted or whatever.
Exactly. And actually, and I'm thinking of another really good example maybe where people, if people had a bit of a neurodiversity lens around it, that they would find their world opened up. Like, for example, how people greet people. You know, like, so there'll be some... So I'm quite well versed in masking the ways of the neurotypical world. Mostly my greetings are fairly normal. But actually, in my radio journalism days, I remember someone once said to me, oh, she said, I feel really sad when you come into the office and you go, hello, but you say it so quietly that no one else says hello back. And I must have been quite ineffectively masking at that point. And then some other people don't say hello at all because they think, I've already met these people, they're my colleagues, I don't need to say hello every day. And they'll be regarded as rude and they'll be talked about as rude. But actually, that is a really good example of what some autistic people might do around greetings. And that little thing that's actually to do with how they perceive the world becomes a whole they are rude, they're not a good colleague, they're not a team player, we're going to shun them, and some whole spiral of chaos happens from a tiny, tiny, tiny thing around different perceptions of a greeting.
And I think that's very, very key. So off the back of that, what aspect of neurodivergence would you say is still the most overlooked in society?
Most overlooked? Oh, that's a good question. I think one thing that I find is quite a common thread through at least ADHD and autistic people, and which other people don't seem to get, is this sort of unwillingness to conform, but quite specifically in terms of playing the game. So you can see that sometimes in workplaces where people don't really want to do the politics thing, and they don't want to do the networking sort of certain people if they don't actually feel like they're directly useful to them, to whatever they see as their immediate output, but what might be helpful to them, but just because schmoozing is like naturally important in loads of jobs. And I think that's something that is not talked a lot about, because I think it's also a slightly new area in terms of psychology and kind of the science of neurodiversity. But they do find that neurodiverse people quite often have a sort of like very different way of looking at morals and like a strict moral code, in terms of like quite often something I find about among neurodiverse people is that they will have a very strong view on why cheating or infidelity is wrong, for example, which I don't see so much in neurotypical people. So yeah, it's a slightly strange one because it's not something that you can easily measure on like a cognitive test on paper. But yeah, I think that's something that goes overlooked, and something I think people maybe struggle with in kind of relationships between neurodiverse and neurotypical people, whether it's outside of work or in the workplace, because they just can't get why a neurodiverse person wants to act in this kind of wacky way. Yeah,
I realise that we've not actually defined from our perspective what neurodiversity is. Obviously, people might class that as, you know, invisible disabilities or cognitive sort of like superpowers. How would you both define neurodiversity in your own senses?
Well, so there's a couple of definitions that I find really useful. So one is that I suppose the standard one that I've been saying, where it's kind of so we're in a neurodiverse world, which means there are neurotypical and neurodivergent people, and like biodiversity, this is a positive range of ways of thinking, feeling and processing the world. In addition to that, I'm interested in adhere to the idea of neurodiversity as a movement. So not just saying, look, there are some people who have a slightly different way of being, feeling, thinking, but saying, not only should we be aware of this, not only should we accept this, we should positively celebrate this, and we should make alterations in our world. As you were indicating earlier, maybe it's that the world is not accommodating neurodivergence. We should be actively, as movements of disabled people have been doing. I mean, clearly there's massive overlap between the disability rights movements and neurodiversity movements. We should be actively seeking to be accommodated.
How about you, Piranha?
Yeah, that's a great definition. I've never really thought of the definition of neurodiversity, as odd as that may sound. I think of it probably quite simply as brains which think differently to the norm. And I know that that's something we talk about a lot, and it's such like a, I don't know, the kind of thing you read on like corporate brochures a lot, like where it's like, we welcome people who think differently here and all that kind of thing. But I suppose I think of it as the purest form of that, where someone either has ADHD or dyslexia or autism or Asperger's or something like that. But yeah, I really identify with the point around celebrating it being key, because I think people quite often make the mistake of thinking that we want to champion neurodiversity because we want to find a positive in it all among what are, like, frankly, a lot of negatives and what can be quite tiring, like especially in the world we currently live in. But I really do think that there are just huge benefits that come along with these, in which we're recognising more and more all the time. And yeah, I think it could make a huge difference. I
mean, on stereotypes, you know, often discussion around being neurodivergent is limited to the stereotypes that people have. People might clock on someone who might have OCD or all these kind of like behavioural tics and so on. And usually focusing on the negatives. How can we shift the narrative to be a lot more, not a lot more positive, but shift the narrative around neurodiversity to be a lot more accurate or representative?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's tricky because I quite often find there are extremes when we talk about neurodiversity. So in the past, and certainly at the time when I was getting diagnosed, ADHD was seen as a disorder for people who were kind of off the walls and a bit nuts, and certainly didn't apply to women who tend to be more like dreamy as opposed to bouncing off the walls. But I also don't want us to be in a position where we only talk about the kind of sexy aspects of neurodiversity, because I mean, yeah, I can tell you lots of funny things about where I've accidentally left my passport, and how, I don't know, I do all these weird things like sometimes do dance routines in the middle of my day if that helps me concentrate. But then there's also just like copious amounts of lists that I have on my phone, and all kinds of things that are less exciting to talk about. And I think the really key thing is that we represent neurodiversity accurately, as opposed to only focusing on one of those two aspects.
And actually that makes me think about how the superpowers narrative is definitely too far to an extreme as well, because actually you know, there's the idea of so Rain Man is many people's first encounter with the idea of autism, for example, but that character was an autistic savant. Most autistic people are not autistic savants with astounding superpowers of memorising a phone book. And so for me, a great benefit to the idea of neurodiversity is that it can be a really useful umbrella for lots of conditions that otherwise might not be recognised as having things in common, and for people who might otherwise not be recognised as having things in common. And it helps recognise the value of people across all those spectrums. It suits me a lot to use the word neurodiversity rather than autistic, because if I say I'm autistic, that is still so stigmatised, and so it's like dropping a little grenade into a conversation, because someone's like, but you were so like warm and friendly, my brain has exploded, what's going on? I don't understand, like if they don't know much beyond the stereotypes. And whereas I can now say, oh, yeah, I'm neurodivergent, and they're like, neurodivergent, yeah, it's quite sexy actually. Well, yeah, neurodivergent, that's good. My big law firm's just done a big thing about neurodiversity. For me, it's a little bit of a Trojan horse to address some of the things that I'm quite interested in addressing around equality, actually. But maybe I shouldn't admit that. But yeah, neurodiversity is useful as a term, and also because then it. Of course we have common cause, autistic people and someone with Tourette's and a dyslexic person and an ADHD person and someone who's had a stroke and doesn't actually see and experience the world in the same way anymore. We probably, there are so many things that are utterly different, but we probably all experience time a little bit differently to neurotypical people in different ways. We probably need differing amounts of rest than a lot of neurotypical people. We probably do projects in our own unique ways and need the time and space to do that. We have lots to offer the world, but not always in a way that fits with the productive values of neoliberal capitalism, although sometimes very much so, which is why ADHD is far sexier, because it kind of fits with...
Yes, yeah.
It's quite, you can go quite big on neoliberal capitalism and ADHD. Not in reality, actually, because I think it can be quite challenging to fit into the systems by which we are measured and parcelled out. But actually, it can be made to fit the narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's so true. We were talking about this before, just about what I don't know, the trajectory of sexiness of different neurodiverse conditions. And yeah, I find it really interesting because a few years ago, and certainly when I was getting diagnosed, it felt like ADHD was quite a taboo thing, and it was almost like no one has ADHD. And now I'd say something like 50% of people I mentioned that I have ADHD to seem to think that they might also have ADHD. And yeah, I definitely see, which I didn't quite fully think about, but like it's much easier for me to say that I'm ADHD than for you to say that you're autistic, because yeah, people just go, oh yeah, I think I might have a bit of that. You must be really like fun and kind of hyper. And yeah, I mean, maybe every condition will follow the same trajectory as ADHD one day, but...
That makes me want to talk about intersectionality a bit then, because I suppose almost want to even it up, because in another way, for me, as a white woman, it's easier for me, I think, to be, I mean, there's still a massive issue for ethnic minority diagnosis around neurodivergent conditions, actually. And I'm kind of very aware of that as a not talked yet enough about in the world of neurodiversity, I think.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I had was literally just that, you know, how we can improve greater representation of neurodiverse individuals, because often it's limited to the stereotypical, you know, white straight male who has X. How can we ensure that there's more representation, but also how could we increase the appetite amongst different communities to recognize that and embrace it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's such a good point, because I feel like a lot of people switch off when they hear the word intersectionality. I think they think that it's sort of some kind of peak woke thing, but when you look at what it actually means, there are really concrete examples of why different things intersecting in your life really matter. And so, I mean, I can think of a lot from my experience first of all, as like growing up in a South Asian immigrant household, like I probably did develop more masking behaviours because I did just work extra hard and would sacrifice other things. So that's one thing that makes getting a diagnosis harder. I suppose there's also likely to be more stigma within communities, like as you're mentioning. One really interesting thing I found when I went to an ADHD group is there were a lot of people from Black and Asian backgrounds there, and a lot of people had this experience of their parents, when they were growing up, thinking that they'd done something bad, and that was why they were a bit off the wall or a bit quirky, and were kind of like praying to God or saying you should be praying more to get rid of whatever you have. It was just so interesting, because you wouldn't think like something like that happens. And last of all, the other thing is, so part of the reason I don't take medication, or in fact really the only reason, is the side effects were too significant for me. And I think what they're starting to find, and the kind of cutting edge of ADHD science, is that is quite common with Asian women, and that a lot of these drugs are basically created for white men, which, like, as you'd expect, because it's always men who've been diagnosed with ADHD in the past, and these drugs are developed for Americans, not for Indians. But yeah, I think there's so much that makes things different for people from ethnic minorities and who have other disadvantages in their life. And I think what changes, the easiest thing to say about what changes these things is time, because I've seen how attitudes have changed in communities and even within my own family over time, and when I speak to my parents more and more about what I've been through, but you know, I feel like that's not a good enough answer, and I want there to be something simpler than time is going to change things.
Yeah, I feel it's time. It's small, gradual, incremental shifts in attitude and awareness, isn't it? As more and more people are diagnosed and talk about it, so you have a public platform to talk about it, and that in itself is then going to open some people's eyes. I have a public platform and I will talk about my diagnosis, and that, even if I meet with disbelief sometimes, that is still opening a door for somebody else then to come along and go, yeah, I'm autistic too. It feels in some ways we're only as a society just beginning to get to grips with mental health stuff more. And hopefully, however many years down the line, we will then get to grips with neurodiversity stuff. It feels like the natural thing to follow in the wake of understanding mental health issues, maybe.
Yes, that's so true.
Another natural thing is in the presence of many organizations that are great advocates, some which are also a few which might be considered quite controversial. And around the neurodiverse community, I think one which has had some criticism is Autism Speaks. And I wonder, from your perspective, how can we reclaim the narrative, and how do we sort of like, what are the steps we need to take to ensure that organizations that represent neurodiverse communities or segments are able to properly do that?
Well, I suppose I want to say, I mean, Autism Speaks is an organisation that has, I think, caused great harm in lots of ways to perceptions of autistic people and to autistic people. And it is quite upsetting to still see celebrities kind of coming forward going, yes, I support Autism Speaks, because what they are not, they're not coming from the very, very fundamental place that it seems really important to come from, which is, I mean, the disability rights movement knows this. Nothing about us without us. You can't speak on behalf of a community without including that community, or in fact preferably having that community lead it. Now, and this is why I suppose again neurodiversity is important, because literally the means to speak can vary across conditions, can't it? And I know I'm here with my verbal privilege as a never shuts up autistic person, and there are some autistic people who are non-verbal, who literally really don't have a voice in many of these discussions, who also need to be included in these discussions. And again, that's maybe, like I'm going to say, it's really good that you could have ADHD people kind of playing a particular role in a neurodiversity movement, because I think generally ADHD people are more likely to speak and be able to speak and articulate. But actually, if it's done not from just an ADHD place, but a wider neurodiversity movement, that's where the power of many voices can overcome these, what feels to me like a very old-fashioned way of representing a community or doing charity. You know, Autism Speaks, it's the I don't, what's the right word? It's like white saviorism, but in disability.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. I mean, yeah, my closest example to Autism Speaks within the ADHD world is there used to be this doctor who was touted again and again years ago called Dr. Richard Saul, who wrote this book, which I can still picture the front cover because it's bright yellow and it sort of screams at me, and its title is ADHD Does Not Exist, which is obviously not something you want to read when you're ADHD. And it was frustrating because 99% of psychiatrists or whatever would say that ADHD does exist, but he was the 1%, and lots of media outlets picked on him to come forth and talk about how ADHD doesn't exist. And I think things like that are changing, but I think, like you're saying, like the key is that you're listening to people who do have that experience of neurodiversity, because I don't fully believe that unless you've experienced something, you're not able to comment on it. But it is overwhelmingly clear to me that people who haven't experienced ADHD, on the whole, don't tend to get it. And yeah, the thing that I think is nice is that a lot of the traits that come with things like ADHD and dyslexia and some other things, would I say could see us overrepresented, if anything, in more creative spheres, and the spheres that people look to and see public figures from. And to me, that's like a nice bonus, which we should really try to capitalise on, to make sure that people can see a different side to neurodiversity to what they thought it was. And like you say, like I think there is particularly a role for maybe ADHD people to speak on behalf of non-verbal autistic people. Yeah.
We've spoken a lot about society, norms, behavioral tics and perceptions. A lot of day-to-day lived experience is almost dictated by the government. And it's almost could be made easy by those who make legislation and the kind of legislation they've done. They've done the Equality Act and they've done many things that have mandated many schools, places of work to make reasonable adjustments for different groups of people. Do you think the current piece of legislation goes far enough? And if not, what one piece of legislation would you introduce?
Can we have the Neurodiversity Act, please? And I speak, since I'm speaking here at the Oxford Union, where you might run the country in future, Michael, so crack on, get the Neurodiversity Act in. We've got the Autism Act of 2009, which theoretically would mean many accommodations and recognitions of the needs of autistic people, but it's mostly not resourced and not enforced. So it's not as useful as it could be. And again, maybe, yeah, a Neurodiversity Act. I hadn't even thought of that. That's a brilliant idea.
In addition to the Neurodiversity Act, frankly, I think just funding for people to get diagnoses. In some areas, it takes 7 years for people to get an ADHD diagnosis. I'm aware that every interest group will basically say, this is the thing we should be focusing on, this is where we need the funding. But I think the thing that I've really seen is just how much a diagnosis can completely, not only transform someone's life, but like transform their ability to contribute to the economy, to do their job really well. I've seen people just go from a kind of failing everything student to becoming an A-star student because they started taking ADHD medication, who got some coaching in the workplace and realised what they needed to do to absolutely smash it at their jobs. And I really don't think it's exaggerating to say that you would get the money back in spades from what you spend on allowing people to get diagnoses.
Well said. Yeah, and agree around autism, waiting lists are really long. Yeah. People really struggle to get those diagnoses, and for adults there is not a lot of post-diagnostic support. And again, if you've got, the suicide rate of autistic people is 9 times higher than that of the general population. And the average age of death of an autistic person is 54. And a lot of that is because of difficulties communicating with doctors and being in medical environments. You have some massive inequalities and disparities in terms of health and social outcomes, which, better access to diagnosis and post-diagnostic support, and tailored mental health support, because much mental health support actually, this is an issue particularly for children. Well, it is an issue for adults, but they don't have the support anyway. For children, for a child with an autism diagnosis who's trying to get mental health support for the mental health issues they are so much more likely to have, they're often shunted off away from the CAMHS teams because they'll say, we can't deal with you because you're autistic. I'm glad you've asked that question. there is so much that is lacking, and as you say, if the little that could be put back in would be repaid with, and again, I'm totally pandering to neoliberal capitalism and its needs, but that's quite useful when we're in the system. Flipping heck, your neurodivergent workers are some of your best workers, I think, in many ways, able to focus, to think differently, to be really passionate about their organisation. What a waste if we're not doing this as a society. Definitely.
I mean, I think there is a study that showed that the workplace that has the most diverse set of people in terms of backgrounds and outlooks, and including abilities, have the highest levels of productivity, and it seems that the inability for the government to support or improve funding for people to be, able to get diagnosed and get support seems to be overlooking how we can make our society much more economically beneficial. One thing I want to go on to very quickly is specific intersectional issues that neurodivergent people have. I think we noted earlier on about, the older you get, the less likely it is for you to get diagnosed, especially given that, the opportunities to have that are less, because you might be in a workplace and probably have to pay for your own diagnosis if you don't want to go through 7-year NHS wait list. What specific challenges do you think that neurodiverse women face, and can you discuss the intersectionality between ableism and misogyny? I note as well that the way ADHD and types of ADHD plays out in different genders is also prevalent as to why people are not recognized earlier on when they're young.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing is that as women, we've been so sort of socialized into being tidy and putting on the perfect front and being the thing that everyone else wants as opposed to what we want to be. And that can quite often mean that it looks smooth on the surface, but like underneath the duck is like flapping everywhere. And I think it can be like, it can make it hard for us to get a diagnosis, frankly. But it also just means that our life can be really tiring. Like, it's more okay for me to be an ADHD guy and be a bit all over the place and a bit messy, or I would imagine to be like an autistic guy, because as everyone says, all men are on the spectrum. And to be a woman who is neurodiverse, it's just very different because we things are changing, but like we were brought up to be prim and proper, and yeah, I think the main thing that creates for us, frankly, is just like exhaustion, more so probably than for men, because yeah, we're the ones who have to keep it together and who have to do the kind of the legwork, even in the home, kind of socially, to make sure that everything runs smoothly.
Yeah, and actually, so in autism, there's been a lot of research recently about masking and camouflaging and how that means that many fewer women are diagnosed. And this camouflaging, which is often, it's part of a result of, as you put so well, how women have to be seen in a certain way as keeping it together. But also it results in poorer mental health outcomes if you're masking all the time, pretending to fit in when you don't. And it's indicative of increased trauma. I'm thinking of where we are because it's really fascinating. Like, so there's the stereotype of the Oxford professor who's in his office, like doing, I don't know, quaffing sherry and being eccentric everywhere. And, you know, I presume that happens less nowadays, but maybe it's still a thing. Is the equivalent female professor able to sit in her office quaffing sherry, being really weird? No, she's probably had to work 20 times harder to get to her position as a professor. And then, as you say, has to be seen to hold it together. You know, quadruple that if we're adding in ethnicity factors or class factors.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
What if there's if you're a working class woman who, there again, working classness. For me, if I was here more often, hanging out the Oxford Union, I would probably use my perceived working classness to mask my autism, perverse example of how intersectionality can work. It'd be like, it's because she's from the north. Not because she's autistic, she's just northern. And that would kind of work. I love how these identities can be played with very productively and interestingly. And actually academia is a great example of a place where it can be played with. But
yeah. But I mean, that's such a good example. I mean, like people always say that Boris Johnson sort of has ADHD traits, and it's like the classic, like, can you imagine Boris Johnson as a woman, like having had, who knows how many children with different partners, and then being scruffy hair. Like, can you imagine like Theresa May like turning up with scruffy hair? Like that just would never have happened. The one thing I would say though is that I do recognise that as a woman, I have had some privilege in terms, well, I've had many privileges, but I've had some privilege specifically as a woman in terms of being able to talk about my diagnosis and everything around it and the medications with my friends and like talk about the mental health impacts of that. And I do get that like as a man, it's just not like that yet. But overwhelmingly, I do think for women, it's harder.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, yeah, that's really good, really helpful contributions. I wonder, just honing on what we spoke about in terms of the workplace and how these kind of things play out, what changes specifically do you think could be made in workplaces, and and should the onus be on employers to ensure that, or should the onus be on neurodiverse people to ask for things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the way I've always done things is I have spoken about what I do differently, if anything at all, or what I need. And that has changed in terms of seniority, because I think when you become more senior, you do things your own way a bit more, and you don't really need to ask people questions. And also sectors, because I worked in business as a consultant before journalism. But it's tended to be that I will say what I need and then have a discussion about that with whoever, and then that is put in place. I mean, I think it's on both people, right? Because like, as an employer, you can't possibly guess what your employee needs. And sometimes you don't want to be assuming things or kind of be patronising and just assume that someone can't possibly concentrate on anything ever because they're ADHD. But yeah, I think it's ultimately on both parties. And I think the thing that's hopefully changing is that employees will feel like they're able to ask for more, and they're not the weird ones anymore, because there are so many other weird people out there, it turns out. So I think we're in a situation where it's much easier for us to ask for things, and people should be encouraged to, because they have the support of legislation and various other things behind them.
I mean, I think really, until the Neurodiversity Act exists, employers should run alongside their diversity and equality training. They should be very explicit about neurodiversity. I don't think at the moment that quite happens. Yeah. And that will then enable employees to come forward and ask for accommodations. And I think if employers know more about what sort of accommodations they might offer, which, as we've said, is often just the tiniest little things. I mean, if you've got loads of autistic employees, for goodness sake, make sure there's a really quiet, sensorily relaxing room for them to go to. Like, I would say that's a must, but I imagine there's lots of organisations where that's not a thing. Just talking about it means it's more likely to happen. I'm doing a talk for a law firm in a couple of weeks, and it's because their diversity person recognises that they don't really know how to talk about neurodiversity, but she also recognised they probably have, if it's 15%, they have loads of employees who are neurodivergent in some way. So once it starts to be out there, so I kind of feel hopeful about that, but feels like we are at an early place.
No, you're right, and I do think actually I had the advantage of the first workplace my first workplace was a very kind of clearly pro D&I, here's the section on our website if you need special assistance or whatever kind of workplace, and that meant that that enabled me to be confident. And you do need that kind of that sense of open arms, at least, and like come and ask me questions from a workplace before especially like as a young person, but in any space you're navigating, to be able to feel confident to come forward with the things you need.
Definitely, and so therefore I think it is the employers who have to lead on this,
Yeah.
and lead strongly actually. They need to make the invite, they need to open the doors.
Yeah, that's almost it. Like, final question for me. We noticed earlier on you talked about how neurodiverse people tend to be creatives. You talked about how there's a probably majority in the poetry group that you're part of, which is really exciting. Some of the most brilliant artists have been neurodiverse, yet the industry itself can be inaccessible. Is neurodiverse talent overlooked? And much more poignantly, to what degree can we encourage more people to basically explore creative careers if they feel pigeonholed to things that do not suit them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because so like I said, I used to work in business before, and I didn't necessarily not enjoy it or struggle with it, though it certainly wasn't sort of typically suited to my most ADHD traits. And now I'm in journalism, and it just feels so natural because everyone sort of has piles of papers which are overflowing and is always dropping things and forgetting things. I think helping people to understand just how much a difference a career which plays to your strengths and your creativity, if you're neurodiverse, is really key, because I don't think I fully grasped the extent to which my life would be so different now, where I'm in journalism, and I really do get up super excited every morning to work on whatever I'm doing. I think having examples of people who've made that shift or who talk about their day is super important. But I think it's tricky because naturally creative spheres, as with anything, have so many barriers, like specifically to do with class, and like how are you going to get into journalism in London if you have to do unpaid internships and you don't know anyone who lives in London and can't stay with them. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is where a lot of schemes, I think, in the creative industry, specifically there's one called Creative Access, which has done really well at kind of increasing diversity in a lot of different spheres, are important. But yeah, I think it would be great if there could be more things like that. Thank you.
So that concludes tonight's little panel on neurodiversity and celebrating excellence. So thank you so much for coming through tonight. I hope that you enjoyed the panel, and I hope to hopefully speak to you guys once more. So thank you for coming through tonight.